I'm Dr. Betty Stewart, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of North Texas at Dallas. Today's topic is how core values of education and enlightenment can lead to lasting change. I would like to express my appreciation to President Bob Mung, who assembled this speaker series, and invite him to say a few words today. President Mung.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Thanks to all the deans for joining us today. In the face of these historic last few months, we felt compelled as a university community to dig deeper into the world we are confronting. A world that is both globally in turmoil and churning in our own backyard. This is not one of those times that the pain is happening far away in isolated pockets so we can mull over for a few minutes and then move on with our lives. Not this time. As it turns out, we are in complete solidarity with our colleagues in Delhi, in Cape Town, and Sao Paulo, and countless other places in this never more clearly realized global community. In just a few months, our students, our faculty, our staff have confronted the chaos of a global pandemic and civil unrest surrounding police violence past and present. It hasn't been easy. It has required a new way of meeting the world, a new way of learning, a new way of facing ourselves and our futures. I have watched how you responded, and I believe you are bravely meeting this test. You have taught, our faculty has taught in innovative ways, sometimes jumping into the deep end of the pool to reach your students. Our staff have served with attentiveness and skill, students first, in your remote home offices. And students, you have hung in there with determination and resiliency that inspires us all. In the last several days, our UNT Dallas Responds series has explored themes facing us all. Today, our panel of scholars will tackle a topic that has intrigued human beings for as long as men and women have thirsted for knowledge and meaning in their lives. Scholars can help us make sense of our time and place, drawing on the lessons of our past and connecting dots in the present. It seems to me you have never been more relevant, and that's why I'm looking forward to this discussion. No pressure. Dr. Stewart.
Thank you, President Mung. Joining me today are the deans, the academic deans of this university for this discussion. Present are Dean Felicia Epps from the College of Law, Dr. Constance Lacey, Dean of the School of Human Services, Dr. Orlando Perez, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dr. Ali Shaklia, Dean of the Graduate School, Dr. Karen Shumway, Dean of the School of Business, and Dr. Lisa Hobson, Interim Dean of the School of Education. So let's begin our discussion now. Panelists, despite rhetoric to the contrary, earning a college degree is not only worth it, it is absolutely critical to improving the social and economic well-being of our nation's citizens. This is especially true for our communities that have been persistently underserved by our educational system, namely low income, first generation, and minority populations. The college degree earned by our students from under-resourced communities should not be narrowly focused only to allow students to get a job. Instead, their higher educational experience should be one that trains and challenges them to think, to analyze, to communicate effectively, to be creative, and to make informed decisions as a result of knowledge and skills learned. And students who have demonstrated high academic performance should be encouraged to pursue graduate and professional degrees. It is that enlightenment through higher level thinking spoken of by W.E.B. Du Bois that allows them to become lifelong learners. A review of the history of educational attainment for people of color shows one that is riddled with inequality, including a lack of access and opportunity. Derek Bell, the first African-American law professor at Harvard and former dean of the University of Oregon's law school, stated that education leads to enlightenment. Enlightenment opens the way to empathy, and empathy foreshadows reform. My first question is to Dr. Shaklia. Dr. Ali Shakli is Dean of the Graduate School. He earned a BS in mathematics from Birzeit University. He has three master's degrees in mathematics, one in applied mathematics, one in pure mathematics, and one in math education. And he has a PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Shaklia, tell us your thoughts on the role of education in promoting critical thinking.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for allowing me to be part of this panel. And I also would like to thank President Mang for initiating this important series. I think one of the most significant goals of education is to produce long life learners who can think critically, learners who use what they know to enhance their own lives and also to contribute to their communities and societies. Education, in my opinion, is no longer just about information. It is really more about improving critical thinking and helping learners to become better problem solvers. In educational theories, we always talk about models of teaching, and one of the models, mastery learning model, which tells us that everyone can achieve mastery if given the needed support in the right environment. And here it comes our roles as educators, which is really to provide the needed support to help learners to rise to the goal and not ever to lower the bar. We always need to have smart goals with high expectations at all levels. And I think learners will rise. And here, by the way, by learners, I mean students, community leaders, and educators. Critical thinking, I think, is a skill that separates innovators from followers. And so to improve this skill as educators, I think we need to develop and lead a culture of learning, a culture in which learners understand why things are the way they are, propose solutions, and also correctly predict the possible consequences of actions at all levels. I think this is happening, but I think it needs to happen in a larger volume, and elaborate more if time permits later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shockley. My next question is to Dr. Hobson. Dr. Hobson earned a BA in elementary ed from Millsaps College, a Master's of Education from Mississippi College, and a PhD in Educational Administration from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Hobson, as probably the only one of us who started their career in K-12 education, tell us how education can be used to empower us to make a difference.
Thank you, President Mung and Provost Stewart, for the opportunity and convening this panel. I actually love today's topic. Education is empowerment because it can provide the tools for managing and overcoming issues of inequality to promote social justice. I believe it's important for our youth to develop in environments where they are exposed to positive action and community organizations that demonstrate how to advocate, affect change, and make a difference. As you hear from the accent and from my degrees, growing up in the Deep South as a youth, I had the opportunity to participate in activities and receive education with the National Council of Negro Women, even attending one of their daycares. So as a result, I saw the efforts of the organization through the women's career successes and what they were doing in the community, including within my own family. The national founder of the organization advocated for human, civil, and women's rights. So beyond lamentation and sort of complaining about issues, the activities they were doing, the exposure and awareness gave me very early experiences, even early childhood, elementary, and how you facilitate community change to improve conditions and circumstances. The images they provided for me were very powerful and left an indelible imprint and impact even on my life today. So I was able to just grow up seeing activism, how you do it well, how you make an impact, and how you make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hobson. My next question is for Dr. Perez. Dr. Perez serves as Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He earned a BS in Biochemistry from the University of Miami and a BA in Political Science from Florida International University. He also earned a Master's and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Perez, tell us about the role of education in helping us become engaged citizens in a democratic society.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Stewart, and thanks to President Mong for sponsoring this important series of conversations. I think in times of crisis, UNT Dallas' mission to empower, transform, and strengthen our community takes on added importance. Political, social, economic, and health crises often lead us to question the very essence of our democratic system. Can our democracy cope with the challenges of racism, economic inequality, social injustices, and the devastating effects of a pandemic? It might be easy for some to point to the inadequacies of a particular administration, but many of these problems we face are systemic and structural, and thus require deeper thinking and long-term structural changes. However, deeper thinking and long-term changes cannot happen without an engaged, knowledgeable citizenry. A system based on the ideal of government of, by, and for the people cannot sustain itself without an educated citizenry. Our students are thus more than just doctors, lawyers, accountants, psychologists, biologists, teachers. They are also citizens, members of a political community, and as such are called to make political decisions every day of their lives. The health and well-being of our community depends on those decisions. Thus, I would argue that among the most important roles and responsibilities our students and every one of us really face, other than perhaps to our own family, is as citizens. This is an essential part of a democracy. It cannot function or survive without it. Therefore, the university and universities in general have a unique responsibility to prepare our students obligations of being an engaged participant in the civic and public life of our community. Not just voting, but also protesting, what the First Amendment calls the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Some of the skills we should focus on include what Dr. Shackley about, critical thinking, questioning, analytical reasoning, but also softer skills such as effective communication, written and oral, ability to cooperate, to build consensus, to work in groups, to solve problems, cultural competency, the knowledge of the other, empathy, and understanding that we are not isolated, as President Mong mentioned, that we live in an interconnected world. If there's anything that we've learned from COVID is the extreme interconnectivity of the global community. The fact that there are Black Lives Matter protests across the world and that movements to remove statues of racist or colonial icons have occurred all over the world is also a clear manifestation that we do not live on an isolated island, that we are all connected. Education also provides valuable context to the events of today. In a time of rapid change, marked by Twitter memes, hot takes, Instagram, TikTok videos, etc., the ability to contextualize what is happening today helps us to reflect on the origins, evolution, and consequences of the problems we. Systemic racism and police brutality didn't start with George Floyd. COVID-19 did not create health disparities and economic inequality. It revealed the underlying pathologies of our system. As one commentator put it in an article in The Atlantic recently, COVID caught America with pre-existing conditions. Education is thus an integral part of helping solve many of those pre-existing conditions, or at least it's a first step to help us understand the underlying problems that face the community. But perhaps more importantly, education is a means of acquiring the skills necessary to contribute effectively in the formulation of possible solutions. Finally, I think education is the primary vehicle for developing engaged, knowledgeable, compassionate citizens able to exercise their rights and obligations through effective participation and critical thinking. Only then will we truly be able to empower, transform, and strengthen our communities.
Thank you, Dr. Perez. Dr. Shumway, this question is for you. But before you begin, I'd just like to tell people a little bit about you. Dr. Shumway received her BA in economics from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, an MBA from the University of Chicago, and a PhD in business administration and management from the University of Illinois at Chicago. So my question is, Dr. Shumway, when you think about Derek Bell's quote about how education leads to enlightenment and enlightenment opens the way to empathy, tell us about the role of allies in education.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished group, and thank you for introducing me to the quote from Derek Bell. Ever since you first read it to me, it's been rolling around in my mind for a lot of different reasons. So for me, education leads to enlightenment. The first part of that quote, I think personally, my education led me to the rudiments of an awakening, to the reality that the sense of social justice in white men could not be trusted. It was a product of institutionalization that became very old very quickly. I was introduced to racism at a very young age. I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in 1958. In 1963, my father, who was an FBI agent at the time, just starting out his career, was sent to Memphis to handle the racial tensions there as integration was progressing. We moved there shortly after Medgar Evers had been murdered across the river in Jackson, Mississippi, and it was a very difficult time fraught with a lot of fear and violence. As my father's career progressed and we moved around the country, these issues became even more clear to me as a child. Later in the 70s, through most of the 70s, we lived in St. Louis. where my father drove us around the city and showed us the results of racial protests and the products of inequity. And as a young child, those images were indelibly printed on my mind. I can still see them to this day in my brain. And at that time, as the schools around me were becoming integrated, I was often called upon as the top person in my class to tutor the other children, okay, who were coming to us with disparities in their education. I did so willingly. I enjoyed it. I got a few laughs out of it. I remember one little girl who didn't want to learn spelling told me that she was pretty sure she could learn to spell if she could have the dessert out of my lunchbox. So for me, I saw somewhere along the line that education was definitely the ticket out of fear and violence, wherever that fear and violence came from. So while each disenfranchised group may experience it differently, the message results in the same feelings of lack of trust, of somehow being less than everybody else. And when that distrust colors your life, then other types of fruitful partnerships and relationships become impossible and our society becomes dysfunctional. All right. I fear that that's what we're seeing again, as I've seen so many other times in my lifetime, and it makes me incredibly sad. I feel that I've been an ally in these fights for 27 years. I have worked in nothing but institutions that have served minority and other underserved populations. Through both positive and negative experiences in the educational setting, I've been able to examine my own worthless and distrustful feelings and try to help others work through theirs. I think, like Dr. Shockley said, that education gives us the critical thinking skills to discern first what we need to change in ourselves, and then what powers us to individually change the rest of society. Education should also provide us with mechanisms to identify others like ourselves and allies like myself who can leverage individual change into powerful societal change.
Thank you, Dr. Shumway. My next question is for Dean Epps. Dean Epps is Dean of the UNT Dallas College of Law. She earned a BA from Cornell College in Iowa and a JD from Creighton University School of Law. Dean Epps, you are familiar with the work of Derek Bell as a legal scholar. Share with us your thoughts on education as a means to reform.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. And Dr. Stewart used a quote which was just repeated from Professor Derek Bell to kick off our discussion today. His life work actually illustrates how education leads to enlightenment, empathy, and reform. Derek Bell is one of my heroes. He was an advocate for racial justice, tireless advocate, and backed up his words with his actions. He was a prolific scholar, but he was so much more. He is credited with being the founder of critical race theory, which, kind of simply put, is built on the analysis that race is a social construct that is used by those in power to keep that power. He was active in giving birth to that whole discipline, putting his education to use to bring about a change. In 1980, he left his position as dean of the University of Oregon Law School because they refused to hire an Asian American woman who he had selected for a faculty position. Illustrating, taking action, believing something and being willing to act on that. He later went on to be the first tenured law professor African American law professor at Harvard Law School, a position that he walked away from in 1990 because there was not a tenured African American woman faculty member at Harvard. His education led to enlightenment and personal sacrifice that led to reforms in those places, because of course now Harvard has tenured African American women as law professors, and things have also changed at the University of Oregon Law School. When I thought about that Derek Bell and the quote that was shared, I thought about a short story of his that I read years ago, but it really stuck with me. It's called The Space Traders. Simply put, the story is of an alien spaceship that arrives in the United States and says, the aliens say, we will solve all of your problems, whatever they are, economic, environmental, if you will trade us and give us every African American person in your country. So after some discussions about the morality of this, about the rights of individuals, the Constitution, all of that, the end of the story is that the decision is made to give all of the African Americans to these space traders so they can be taken off to an unknown destiny. One of the things I took out of this story is that the United States has sold out African Americans again and again for whatever perceived purpose there would be. If you think back to, there was 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War. There was the promise of Brown versus Board of Education that desegregation would happen with all deliberate speed. Those things that seemed to give promise were eventually seen not to be as promising as we first thought. In 2015, I watched, as many in America did, the video showing Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, being shot in the back by a North Charleston police officer. I looked at that and my heart hurt. But the tie-in between these things, of course, is that was 2015. We were enraged, we were excited, all of these things. Now, I will have to agree, not to the level that we are right now, but things have not changed. We just saw this past weekend in Atlanta, shooting of someone going away from a police officer, also shot in the back. So my question becomes, is this another opportunity where African Americans will be sold out, or will something change? We seem very excited with protests, with Civil War monuments being removed, with, as I noticed this week, we're changing Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. They'll no longer be used to sell these products. So we're doing these symbolic things, but how do we get to the type of change that Professor Bell stood for? The concrete actions that really ensure that I won't have to sit just hurt and almost in tears watching another video of an African American man being shot in the back by a police officer.
Thank you, Dean Epps. My question now is for Dr. Lacey. Dr. Constance Lacey is Dean of the School of Human Services. She earned a BS in Social Work from the University of North Texas, a Master's in Social Work, and a PhD in Clinical Social Work from the University of Texas at Arlington. Dr. Lacey, our hearts are hurting over the events of the past 3 weeks. Share with us the role of education in humanity and how empathy leads to or foreshadows reform.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, so much for this opportunity. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues, all of which who have laid the foundation, I think, for this conversation as we talk about how do we move forward. I so appreciate the candor that Dr. Epps brings when she brings to mind what our nation has faced on an ongoing basis. And so from the position of looking at humanity, what we value is the fact that education is accessible to most and attainable for many, and in the right circumstances and situations help move people forward. I am a product of how education and being at the right place at the right time, whether that's through scholarships or opportunities, have moved forward. My mother got her GED when I was 6 years old. She was 36, but she insisted that every one of her children go on and get an education. So 2 of us have a PhD, and the rest of my siblings have at least their bachelor's degree. So there's something to be said about moving us out. However, I think we do our students a disservice if we don't acknowledge how education hasn't always provided a safe place for students, even beyond their education. So we create this environment in our institutions, and we encourage students to speak out and have critical thinking and be civil-minded and to push the powers that be. But university and institutions are a safe place for them. What we sometimes need to help them understand is that power, race, oppression, and privilege are still going to be hurdles that they have to face and jump when they get into the workplace. So they've worked really hard to get their education. But unless we equip them to see everything that they do, I have a colleague who works at a university that trains doctors and nurses, and her job is specifically to help them understand their role as people in places of power to help the disenfranchised and those who do not have access. So I think our latest events highlight how we have more work to do as educators. We do create a platform that helps young people move forward, but we have such a work to do. I think that young people who, and students, because we have a myriad of ages on our campus, which I just so appreciate, because I think there's wisdom that comes from those who have a lived narrative, a lived experience that brings to the young people a perspective that helps sometimes buffer that energy and anger, right? But at the end of the day, as educators, I would like to challenge us to look at how policies within the educational system, how procedures and processes may hinder many from moving forward. I think we have to do some introspection and reflection. And I think by doing that, we model for our students how to move in places of leadership when they are out in their communities and places of influence, and how they take their narratives and they can help change. And that doesn't necessarily mean students of color. That to Dr. Shumway's point, I really appreciate, we need more advocates. We need people who don't move out into the shadows when it gets hot. They stand with us. And there's this theory about proximal proximity. They stand with us, and sometimes they stand before us, in front of us, right? And so I think we have a really great opportunity in education to continue to bring these difficult discussions to the forefront, creating a safe place for our students to talk, to feel, to breathe, to demonstrate empathy to one another. It doesn't matter which side of the race you're on, if you identify, just to create that space, but then to also give them the tools that they need to be able to apply those same qualities when they get into the workplace.
Thank you, Dr. Lacey. You know, we've been meeting as a group of deans, and we are all in agreement about the transformative power of education. And as we've been talking, we've heard some really profound stories. And so I'd like to call on a few of my colleagues, and I'm going to call you in order. But I'd like to start with Dr. Perez. And Dr. Perez, would you share briefly with us what it was like growing up in an immigrant family and the importance of education?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for that question, and particularly today when the Supreme Court ruled on the DACA decision and basically said that the Trump administration cannot end the DACA program as it wanted to. at this time, and I think this is a fantastic victory. It's a first step in securing a long-term status for those dreamers. We at UNT Dallas, as you know, have a number of dreamers as students. They form a very strong part of our community. For myself, I'm a first-generation immigrant to the United States. I came with my parents from Cuba when I was a little toddler, obviously fleeing revolution and political turmoil on the Caribbean island. None, none of my, neither of my parents nor any of my grandparents had ever finished college, ever gone to college. My dad didn't finish high school, but from day one, it was never an option that I would not go to college, that I would not pursue education as the vehicle for empowering, the vehicle for social mobility. So for my family and for me in particular, education was the avenue and the means for achieving a career as an academic and now as an administrator. And I think, you know, my story is very common among the immigrant story. There are millions of us in this country, both dreamers who many of them are born in this country, but also folks who came from other countries and who have found opportunity in this country and are really part and parcel of the fabric of the United States. We wouldn't be the country we are without immigrants. Our communities are because of the contribution of immigrants. And so I think it's important to understand while we talk about systemic racism and we talk about police brutality, that policing and police violence also affects Latinos and also affects our Latino students. And we're not just allies of our African American community, but we are right there beside you, suffering and seeking understanding and engagement to deal with these structural problems.
Thank you, Dr. Perez. Dean Epps, you spoke about the importance of reform. And one of the ways that we can achieve reform is through voting. And you shared with us a personal story about voting and the importance of voting. So would you share with this audience today your experience around voting that inspired you?
Well, yes, I will share that. And actually, this story arises out of rural Arkansas, where my parents grew up, specifically my father. Back then, he had an uncle who insisted on voting, which is admirable. But under the law at the time, there was a poll tax that could be charged. That was an amount you had to pay in order to be able to vote. And my father's uncle insisted upon voting, and he paid that poll tax. And my father explained how some of the rest of the family kind of laughed a little bit at him because he was able to vote having paid that tax, but the Black people's votes were kept in a separate box from the white people's votes. And so they just wondered whatever became of those votes. Okay. We have come a long way since that time, of course. In 1966, I want to throw this in there so that my students know that I do know some about con law, but the US Supreme Court said that poll taxes are unconstitutional, so you could no longer charge that. But it should speak to us all when, tying back to Professor Bell again, in terms of activism, thinking about what is it that you can do in order to change things. Well, you can vote. People no longer pay poll taxes. You may have to stand in a line. You may have to do something special, take some time off work, but voting is very important because you're voting for the judges and the representatives and the people who are going to be making decisions about the law. You can also, of course, make sure that you participate in the census and are counted so that we will have more representatives. And keep in mind, the poll tax wasn't the limit of things that were done to prevent African Americans from voting. There were all kinds of other means. So people fought and died using that activism piece in order for you to vote. So make sure that you get out there and do it. We actually have a receipt from my father's uncle who paid this poll tax. We, of course, hold on to that. That's historically significant. But in my mother's house in Arkansas, there's that receipt showing that he in fact paid that poll tax.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Dean Epps. Dr. Hobbs, you grew up in a family of activists. And would you like to share with us an experience that being in that family of activists, how that experience impacted your life?
Yes, I can speak to that. One of the pieces that I was able to see growing up is that you work to help African Americans gain positions where they could make an influence and make a difference. And so throughout growing up as an elementary child, high school, even in college, we were encouraged to be active in getting people to vote, getting African Americans elected. As an example, in college, and I did find one of the artifacts from when I was in college, and we helped to get circuit court, African American circuit court judges elected. At that particular time, which goes back to 1990, there were 7, I believe, total. So that was the most number of African American circuit court judges since Reconstruction. So that took it back to 1870s. So that was really significant. So we were encouraged to be involved, get people to vote. Even within my family, my mother served as a Hinds County supervisor. Hinds County is the capital county in Mississippi. In Texas, they're called commissioners. In Mississippi, they're called supervisors. She's the only woman to have held that role the entire history of Hinds County. And now that she chose not to run again, having held 7 terms, there are no other women on the board. So I got to see a lot of African American women out there making a difference, being involved in National Council of Negro Women. We got to see artists, poets, activists. We were taken to different museums as children. So it's important to see activism at an early age. It's not necessarily about me or what my family was doing, but it is about when you have an opportunity, you hold a position, you do something in that position. Nowadays, sometimes people who hold a title, they want to get the position, but what do you do to make an impact and give back to the community? So it was just an honor and a privilege to see all these amazing women, what they were doing to make a difference, whether they were the first in a particular capacity, and then beyond being the first, when they got in those roles, how did they help people? How did they improve the lives and the conditions of the community? I think that piece was instrumental. And then the education piece too is how you do it. You get empowerment through education. It gives you the tools. It helps you understand the power structures. It helps you understand oppression and how to fight it and how to do it with sophistication and how to do it systematically and how to do it systemically. That you're able to have a plan in place and a group of people who work together to affect real change, to make a difference beyond holding a title. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hop. Thank you, Dr. Hobson. And my final question is to the remainder of the panel. Would you like to take a few minutes to expound on something you've heard or maybe didn't hear from your colleagues today that you would like to? And I see Dr. Shockley is volunteering to go first here.
Sure. So I just want to elaborate more on the importance of making learning accessible to all people. And, just take a little shift to the higher education. If we look at the visible mission of higher education, we view it as, teaching, research, and service. However, to me, the implied mission is really learning. As educators, I think we need to provide the support to help learners, again, achieve their goals. And by learners here, I mean everybody, students, community leaders, educators. It's really all about facilitating learning and lifelong learning. The goal of teaching is always improving learning and basically to teach so others can learn. That's the teaching, the way we look at it. Research, same way. Research is to build on past learning to create new learning. And again, the third part of the higher education mission is the service. And we all know that the purpose of service is to make learning a tool to improve communities and citizens. So as I said earlier, a big part of learning is improving critical thinking, and research has shown that improving critical thinking has a big impact on improving problem-solving ability, which will lead to the ability to draw the right conclusions, to make the right choices for life. So as educators, I think this is where we can play a big role here to facilitate learning and improve critical thinking as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shockley. Dr. Shumway, would you like to expound on anything you've heard today?
Yes, I'd like to add just a little bit to what I said earlier. When we're particularly in higher education, I think it's really important as part of the educational experience to identify others like ourselves, as well as our allies, who can help us leverage change, our individual change into societal change. But the reality is there are an awful lot of very traditional universities out there that are not doing that. All right, and we're seeing the fruit of that all over the front of the newspapers in the forms of protests on campuses, in the forms of unrest on campuses, and administrators losing their jobs because they've lost sight of what universities are supposed to be about. So I think that there's a large part of education that needs to change going forward. And part of the reason I'm so excited about being part of UNT Dallas is because we know that, okay, we're not traditional. We are not trying to maintain that status quo. We do not segregate our student populations. We are all together in this thing together. And so I believe that the practices that we have implemented at UNT Dallas over its short history are capable of changing both higher education and our society.
Thank you, Dr. Shumway. And then finally, Dr.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you, President Monk. I failed to mention that before. Thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to share our voice. We're often in the background making sure things run smoothly, but being on this panel with my colleagues is a great opportunity for us to share who we are as human beings. One of the areas or populations I'd like to speak to are those parents. We talk about part of our mission being strengthening our community. And I have a very, very short story. My mom, I talked about not getting her GED till she was 36, but my mom was a persistent woman of faith. And I remember when my dad passed away, I was very young, I was 4, and she moved us back to Fort Worth near her family. Fort Worth had not been desegregated. And we had lived in West Texas, and it's my understanding, I'm the youngest of 5, but it's my understanding West Texas began the desegregation process much earlier. And so my mom came to Fort Worth, and by that time I was in elementary school. My first grade year, she tried to put my siblings and I in schools that were predominantly white and was rejected. But she went back again. And so my second grade year, I was the only African American in the entire elementary school. And one of the things I think is very important is I experienced the village taking care of a child. I remember a facilities person, we called them the maid at the time. It was African American older lady, and she would often pay for my milk. My mother, you know, she had 5 kids, so she could only afford a sandwich, but she would make sure I had milk every day. Or if there was, you know, in second grade, you have little accidents, she would come and get me, and she'd make sure I was taken care of. I remember a neighbor who had a taxi business would pick me up from school because we lived too far away. There was no busing, and so either we walked home or the community worked together to get us. And so my mom, I have to give her homage. She's 87 years old, a firecracker. But because of her persistence, we had access to education. My older sister getting her PhD, and then she blazed the trail, if you will, for the rest of us to continue on. And so I think I want to encourage those parents who feel like they don't know how to get their children in school, or they don't know how to encourage them as they're going through. I think persistence and continuing to help your young people understand how important education is going to be in changing their community and changing their families' lives and blazing a trail for the next set of generations to come forth. So I think that's important. We sit in the middle of a community that has not historically had access to higher education. And so our university being placed there on purpose, I think is significant. And we do ourselves a disservice if we don't champion the fact that we give our community the opportunity, first right of refusal, to come to the University of North Texas at Dallas.
Thank you, Dr. Lacey. It looks as if our time is up, and I want to thank you all for participating, and thank you for joining us today. This panel closes out the series UNT Dallas Responds. We would like to thank President Mong for this opportunity to participate in such an important speaker series. We want to continue our conversations, and we would love to hear from you, our audience, on topics that you think we should discuss. Please let us know your thoughts. We've also put together some resources from our discussion today, and we invite you to look at them on our website. Finally, I would like to conclude with the following. Aristotle stated that educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. The University of North Texas at Dallas is poised to meet the challenge of providing access and ensuring success of our under-resourced student populations. Our university serves as a beacon of hope and a place for healing for those wanting to improve their lives and that of their families through education. Our mission of empowering students, transforming lives, and strengthening the communities we serve, and our vision of being a pathway to socioeconomic mobility is powerful and attainable. Our faculty and staff are committed to the work of supporting our mission and vision. We invite you to join us in this great work. Thank you.